and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Bible Study. I want to share something with you guys. Not that it's like important or anything, but just a good opener while we wait for some people to come on. Let me silence that. When I'm getting ready to come to Bible study in front of all you guys, I actually put perfume on. Why do I do that? Do you smell me? That's so nice. I think maybe it's just habit that I'm like, oh, I gotta be with my family today. I should probably wear some perfume. And also maybe it's because it's crazy stinking hot here. My mom just showed me these pictures of outside of her house, and it's like more than a foot deep in snow. And I was like, I'd rather be too hot than too cold. I'm alright. I'm not gonna complain too much, but, you know, still people. Okay, so, hello. Good morning, America. Okay, we are gonna do what I said we were gonna do last week. We are going to start learning about the kings. And I know you might be thinking to yourself, Teneil, why do all of your studies revolve around the Old Testament? That's a great question. Let me answer that for you. Because the Old Testament was extremely confusing and really intimidating to me when I first got into Scripture. And I have learned so much about the heart of God, about the story of Christ and our salvation in totality, to just jump into kind of the more vibrant New Testament things. I think there's a reason why when people visit first world countries or third world countries, they frequently will drop off just a whole mess of New Testament booklets, and that's because the Old Testament can be taken extremely out of context, and the stories, if you don't know them fully, they can be really confusing and misleading. So it was a little difficult for me when I first started putting together today's study in 1 Samuel, because I really find it hard to start in 1 Samuel, because this story is really, I mean, it's one story, so you really have to take it back a little bit. So before we just jump into Scripture, and we're going to read a lot, I'm not going to get fully through 1 Samuel today. I know some of you are like, but I want to hear you talk forever. And the truth is, every single ex-boyfriend I've ever had said the same thing until I talked too much, and then that relationship ended. So I figure if I want you guys to come back, I'm going to have to choose my words wisely, and not just what I'm saying, but how many of them I'm saying. So, now, let's do a little backstory on this before we jump into it so you can see how this is all kind of woven together. Okay, under Ramses II in Egypt, we have this story about Joseph, and that will probably likely be a study all in and of itself. It's one of my favorite books. Okay, but anyways, Joseph does some awesome work for the Pharaoh Ramses II, and he ends up being elevated to a really grand position. And in this position, he's offered a huge plot of land that's in like prime real estate in Egypt. And so he brings his family over, and they start to cultivate the area. Now, that lasted pretty much until that pharaoh died. And the next pharaoh saw that these non-Egyptians had this prime land, and not only that, but that they were growing and multiplying and prospering. And so he was a little bit intimidated and decided that it would probably be better if we just enslaved them. Sad and true. So they spent 430 years in slavery under Egyptian law, Egyptian pharaoh rule. He, baby killing, and it was these were dark times. So enter Moses, and Moses takes the people, his people, the chosen people, God's people, out of slavery and into the promised land. Now, when they get to the promised land, Moses sends spies into the promised land to kind of like scope it out and see if it's okay to take it. And what they find is Nephilim, which again could probably be its own story. Real quickly, if you guys want to get curious about something, I feel like a lot of churches aren't really touching on this these days, but Nephilim were angels descended to earth that mated with the human women because we were so pretty, and created giants. So later on we're going to read about David and Goliath. Goliath is one of these Nephilim, Goliath and his brothers. So they basically come back and they're like, yeah, probably not a great idea to go into the promised land right now because it's full of giants. And so God's really unhappy with that because he's like, look at everything I just rescued you from. What are you doing? So he has them stay in the wilderness then for 40 years until that entire generation dies off. And that way, because of their disbelief, now they can be brought into the promised land. So now, because of, and some other stuff, but because Moses wasn't allowed to go into the promised land, there was one spy that, or I think there was two, that came back and were like, no, this is our land. God gave it to us. We need to go grab it. And so one of those is Joseph. And Joseph ends up being the guy. Love Joseph. He ends up leading people into the promised land, conquering the promised land, taking it back for God's people. And basically becomes like the first in a series of military leaders known as judges. So these judges, it's debatable as to the length of time that they ruled in Israel. Here's what you need to understand, is that the promised land, the people, were broken into tribes. So they don't have one ruler, like we have the president or there's a king. They were small tribal areas, and so they are still now living in what is the promised land, but they're surrounded by enemies. So there's constantly this like push and pull of people trying to take their land back from them, and all sorts of other little things. And so every time there comes a situation where there is obstacles, a judge is like a natural born leader that rises up to save the people. The problem is that the judges is a very dark period of time that shows us human nature when left alone. It is said in the book of Judges more than once that this was a period in time where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. I feel like it's really important to kind of let that sink in for a minute. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. I feel like part of what makes that like hit me so hard is I feel like that's a huge part of where the American people are at right now, because we are so many cultures, because we are from so many different religious backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. We kind of have adopted this feeling of, well, who am I to say that what they're doing is wrong? But we need to be really careful about that, because yes, I believe there's like a live and let live, and I'm not trying to start any major wars right now, but there is a clear line between good and evil. There is a line between right and wrong. And I'm going to be really careful that we don't justify horrible behavior because of that. which is basically what ends up happening in the book of the Judges, is they just go down and down and down until it enters into some really horrific, nasty, nasty stuff. But we're actually kind of set up knowing that this is where it's headed from the time of Moses. So if you're thumping in your Bible, turn to Exodus 32. And you're going to get a really good idea of where I'm going with this. Exodus 32, we're talking about the golden calf. Okay, so Moses has led his people out. He gets to a place where he is writing all of the laws. He is spending a lot of time with God and kind of putting a boundary around, like, he's basically breathing identity into God's people. They've been enslaved for over 400 years and then walked in the wilderness for 40 of those. I mean, we're talking like half a millennia that these people have been so oppressed they don't even know who they are. So he is basically outlining, like, no, you're God's chosen people. This is who you are. And so there comes this scene where Moses goes up onto the mountain to be alone with God, and he doesn't come back for a period of time. I don't think it was very long, but immediately the people saw, we're just going to start at the beginning of 32. The people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain. And the people gathered themselves to Aaron and said, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And so Aaron said, take off all your gold and your from everything you have, basically, and melt it all down. And they made it into a calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Can you imagine? Because God is seeing this. How, like... Anyways. So, God basically says to Moses, they have turned aside quickly out of the way that I have commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Stiff-necked is it means more than just proud. The term comes from when you take two oxen or two cows or two donkeys and you yoke them together. And the idea is that you can lead them and turn them to whatever direction they need to go. And if one is stiff-necked, it means that it's like you're trying to turn it, but it's like it's headed in the direction it's going. And God is saying, like, these people are stiff-necked. Like, I am trying to lead them. I'm trying to teach them something new, and they are so stuck in their path. And the major problem is that they didn't know a different way. They had only seen the rule of the Pharaoh, the rule over them in being enslaved. They've never seen what the outline of what God is trying to do, which God is trying to say, like, I want to be your ruler. I want to be your leader. You don't need anybody else but me. Okay, that is our setup. Now, we have just come through the period of the Judges, which will probably also be a study in and of itself because it's got some pretty incredible stories in there. And we're getting into 1 Samuel. So, ironically, it's not necessarily originally First Samuel, Second Samuel, First Kings, Second Kings, and if you couldn't tell Second Samuel, First Kings, Second Kings, that's where we're headed. Originally, First Samuel and Second Samuel would have been one book, except for the scroll's too big, so it got divided into First and Second. But it would have been, it would have come across as First Kings, Second Kings, Third Kings, Fourth Kings. But for whatever reason, it got renamed into First Samuel and Second Samuel. So I'm okay with that. I don't really see a big problem, but just like fun little history. Okay, so who is Samuel? Where does it come from? Where does he go? Cotton Eye Joe. Samuel is basically the first national prophet. He's the first prophet to be for all people. He is also the last judge. He is a priest. His origin is a pretty amazing story we're going to get into in a second, but he doesn't just anoint the first king, he also anoints the greatest king. Can you guess who that is? Do you know who that is? It's David. A lot of people like to think that David didn't really exist. I completely disagree. The thing I love about the Old Testament is all the characters in the Old Testament, if you were going to rewrite them and you were going to, like most characters from books of old, they kind of glamorize them a little bit. They take away their humanity. And a lot of these stories are so detailed and so colorful that you really get a good sense of the humanity that even the greatest heroes in the Bible go through. So I love that. I love that. Not that it justifies my own flaws. It's just like, if you don't get why I love it, then that should be a study in and of its own. Okay, so the origins of Samuel. There's this woman named Hannah, and Hannah is one of two wives to an upstanding man. Now, his other wife, she has borne him offspring, but Hannah cannot. And at this point in time in culture, your children were basically like your identity. I mean, you were blessed because you had children, and so therefore it went without saying, if you couldn't have children, you were considered cursed. And so the fact that Hannah can't have children, most husbands would have kind of put them aside, but Hannah's husband doesn't. He loves her. And when it comes time for offerings and things, he gives his other wife a portion, and a portion for each of his children. But Hannah, he gives a double portion because he loves her. Even though she's never given him a son or a daughter or anything, he gives her a double portion. But it doesn't help her, partially because the other wife is constantly like nagging on her. It's like her enemy is like knocking her down that she can't have children. And partially because of culture, but also she wants a child. She wants to bear a child of her own. And so the husband does something really sweet. He says, why are you so upset? Don't you know that, aren't I better than 10 sons to you? Like, I love you no matter what. And it's like, I can see like any wife is like, thanks babe, but you just don't get it. So they go up every year to this temple to give a sacrifice. The priest of this temple's name is Eli, and he's a really interesting character we'll talk about a little bit. But Hannah goes up there, and she enters the room where Eli's kind of sitting at the door, and she is on her knees, and she's praying, and her heart is so full and so sad that she's not just praying in silence, but she's praying, but like her lips are moving, but she's not really making a sound because this is like a personal prayer, but her mouth is still moving. And Eli will forgive him for this because he's a good guy, but he goes over to her and he's like, "What are you doing in here, being drunk? Like, put away your wine." And and she's like, "I'm not drunk. I just really want to from my heart." And so, anyways, I think he kind of feels bad because he sees now what was really going on, and he basically says like, God should bless you in this, and God bless you in this. And she leaves, she goes back home, and after some time, she actually does conceive a son. Now, because she conceived a son, let me see here, I'm going to find it exactly. Okay. So we are in. Okay, let's go back to like halfway through 19. And the Lord remembered her, and in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel. For she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. It kind of means like petitioned from the Lord, Samuel. So they went for their yearly sacrifice, but Hannah did not go up. She said, as soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and will dwell there forever. So back in her prayer, what she prays to God is that she says, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on my affliction of your servant, remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to you your servant a son, then I will, if you give me a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. The not cutting his hair, that was like a symbolic thing of your devotion. From what I understand, priests did that at that time. So if you're like, what up with that? That's what up with that. So she basically says, before she gets pregnant, she says, if you allow me to conceive, I will dedicate my child to you. And then when she does conceive, she's like, okay, I get, and it was a commonplace that they get 3 years to wean your child. I know like some of my friends that have had babies would be like 3 years. But this was cultureful, and it actually happens a lot here. It kind of seems weird when you got a 3-year-old on your bay, as we call it. But when he turns 3, they take up a calf, and also a 3-year-old calf, to sacrifice. And she goes up to the temple and she finds Eli, and she says, down in 26, she says, "Oh, my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who is standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And chapter 2, we get to Hannah's prayer. Hannah's prayer actually sets up, because remember, we just finished the first chapter of 1 Samuel, and it's setting us up all the way through Chronicles. And her prayer, really beautiful. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's basically 3 outlining things that she is going through in her prayer that should kind of foretell where this is going. So the first thing that she basically says is that God disposes of the proud and he exalts the humble. We already know that any of our New Testament scripture is gonna outline that. Like, God brings the haughty low, and the last shall become first, the first shall become last. It's a theme throughout the Bible, that God exalts the humble and it's his joy to cut the legs off the proud. So the second point that she makes in her prayer is that despite the tragedy and evil of human workings, God is going to bring about his purpose. So there is kind of a thread throughout a lot of theology these days that basically says, like, God needs me to do this or do that. And if you remember our study of Esther, when Esther's cousin basically looks at her and says, like, it's for you, you need to go before the king and you need to save your people. And she's like, oh, but I could die. And he's like, don't think that if you do or you do not, that deliverance won't come from another place. And like, God's going to bring about what God's going to bring about. It is our great joy and pleasure to be used in that plan. That should be something that we look forward to, that we're willing to do. But he's God. Remember, he went life. Like, he's God. He's gonna do what he's gonna do. That's his great joy. So, regardless of our evil, regardless of our sins, we are never going to outweigh the goodness in God's plan. That's not a license to sin. Don't hear it that way. It means that we are blessed to be used by him, but his plan is not contingent upon our holiness, and thank God it's contingent upon his. So it's not our holiness, it's his holiness. Not our goodness, his goodness. You following me there? Okay. The third thing that she's going to outline here is that God is going to raise up his king. His king. Not our king. His king. And you'll see the difference here in just a second. So, her prayer is a little bit prophetic. Pretty cool. You guys should totally read that on your own time. And I'm going to keep moving on. So, I'm going to basically skip this part, but just know that Eli has 2 sons and they're worthless. It literally says in 12, now the sons of Eli were worthless men. Pretty straightforward. They did not know the Lord. And these guys, okay, so Eli is the head of the temple. He has 2 sons that are also raised up to be like himself. And these guys, they take bribes, they sleep with the women that are manning the gates. They're just wretched people. They actually despise the offerings that go to the Lord, because what would happen is you would take the fattened calves, the fattened part, which means there's a nice big juicy piece of fat on that meat, and they would burn that and cook all that fat and everything out, and it would just, you ever walk into a place that's got a roast going all day and you're just like, oh, that smells good. My mouth is watering right now. My voice just left me too. That was a moment. I'm sorry. I haven't had a roast in a while. So they were like, that's the stupidest thing we've ever heard of. So they're like, give us these choice pieces. And the people are like, okay, just let us burn the fat off of them first as the offering to God. And they're like, no, either you give it to us or we're going to take it. It literally says that. So read through that. But here it comes to Eli's attention that his sons are worthless human beings. And he basically slaps them on the wrist and says, why do you do this stuff? Like, who can protect you from the Lord? Instead of taking up the Lord's case as in, yeah, you're my sons, but this is God we're talking about. He basically says, like, guys, stop it. I'm assuming he talks that way. But the Lord rejects Eli's household because he says, you didn't stand up to me for your sons. So I'm going to kill both your sons on the same day, and there will never be an old man in your house. And that literally happens just like that. So He says, I will raise up, we're down in 35, still chapter 2, and God says, I will raise up for myself a faithful priest that will do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. He's talking about Samuel. Now, this is like one of my favorite scenes in this book, is when God calls Samuel. So Samuel, he starts growing up, and everybody likes him. He's really obedient and kind. He's basically, from the time he was 3, he's basically raised here. To be really honest with you, I don't know how old he is when God calls him. Maybe that's in here somewhere and I've missed it, but I don't think it says exactly how old he is when he calls him, but he's fairly young, and he's laying in bed one night, and it says, down in 4, it says, God called out to Samuel, and Samuel, he's not in bed, actually, he is in the temple, manning the temple, and he wakes up and he's like, I'm here I am. And he thinks that it's Eli, so he runs to Eli's chambers, and he's like, I'm here, you called me. And Eli is like, I didn't call you, go back to bed. So he's like, oh, weird dream. So he goes back to bed, lays down, and God calls him again, Samuel. And he shoots up, and he's like, I'm here, and he gets up and he runs to Eli's room, and he's like, you called me, I'm here, what do you need? Eli's like, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. So he goes back to bed, and again he hears Samuel. And he jumps up and he's like, what? I'm here. He runs back into the room. He's like, I'm here. And Eli finally figures out, he's like, something otherworldly is going on here. So he basically tells him in verse 9, go lie down, and if he calls you again, say, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So Samuel went and laid down in his place, and the Lord came and called as the other time, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant hears. And the Lord said, behold. As we discussed before, it should always be said like that. I am about to do a new thing in Israel. And I won't go through all of that. This is a lot of information to get through, so we're gonna cut through some of it. But he basically tells Samuel, Eli's house is about to fall because of his son's transgressions and his inability to discipline them. I'm gonna bring his house down. And so the next morning when he wakes up, Eli comes to him and he's like, what did God say to you? And he's like, and Eli's like, no, you tell me and don't leave anything out. And he's like, God said he's gonna destroy your whole house? And Eli, his response is pretty perfect. He's like, it is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him. Like, can't really defend yourself on that one, dude. Down, down, down. Bad kids going down. This is a big reason why when people are like, oh, Teneil, you need to have children because there needs to be another one of you running around. But we'll see also for Samuel and his sons that good parents have bad kids all the time. And there is a saying, my dad was the son of a preacher man, and this saying goes, whether it's true or not, if you're like son of a pastor or you're a pastor with kids, I'm just saying, it's a saying, okay, I make it up. Pastors' kids are the worst. Have you ever heard that? I wonder if it stems from this book. Because Eli's kids were really bad. You're going to find out that Samuel grows up, he has 2 sons, and because when he gets older, the people come to them and they're like, look, you're a just guy, you're a good guy, but your sons are not. And you are getting old, and we are afraid for what's going to happen when your sons are the ones judging over us, because they are also corrupt, taking bribes and doing these things. And we want a king. And Samuel takes it to God, and he's like, ugh. And God's like, it's not against you that they're saying these things, it's against me. And if they want a king so bad, give them a king. So, let's skip through. I got a little bit ahead of myself and I skipped one of these really awesome stories. So let's backtrack a little bit, okay? Because we're going to talk about the Ark. The Ark of the Covenant was a box, basically a cedar box lined with gold. The mercy seat sits on top of it, which is where Jesus is said to reign on his second coming. There is some speculation that these days that the Ark of the Covenant is being hidden in Ethiopia, which is pretty cool, and probably why I fly Ethiopian Airlines instead of South African. Because sometimes I get in Ethiopia and I'm like, I could be in the same region as the Ark of the Covenant. Rad. Anyways, that's all just speculative. So basically, the Philistines come and they want to wage war against Israel because they're a glutton for punishment. And just like a little bit of a backup in this, they attack the people, and Israel is like, what are we gonna do? And the Philistines actually win the battle. They kill both of Eli's sons and win the people. And here's what happens. A battle breaks out between Israel and the Philistines. And nowhere in the book does it suggest that Israel went to God to inquire what they should do. And when the Philistines start to gain control over the situation, they decide to bring the Ark of the Covenant as a talisman, thinking that the Ark of the Covenant is what's going to save them. So it doesn't. And reason being because the people, Israel, was so used to having idols and worshiping idols that they turned the Ark of the Covenant into an idol. See what happened there? So they're like, instead of going to God, they bring the Ark of the Covenant in to save them. And it doesn't. The Ark of the Covenant basically houses the stones from Moses, and there is some more godly influence, and you're going to see some of that come to play here, but basically they had turned something God had given them into God himself, and they were using him as a tool, which would have been like really familiar practice with the culture that they had just come from the Egyptians. I think this is really important, but not super popular among Christians these days. But I'm going to say it anyways because I don't care about being popular. I think we are really guilty of doing this. This is one example I'm going to throw out there. Please don't block me. Just hear me. A lot of people turn their mini crosses into talismans. I think that the cross is a good reminder for you. It's a good identifying mark for Christians. You can see a cross around somebody's neck and know kind of an outline of either their upbringing, if not their beliefs. However, due to, I think, a lot of theater and the Catholic Church has put a lot of emphasis on the power of the symbol itself as opposed to the power of the action at the cross. I'm frequently debated about this, but I believe when it says the power in the cross, that it's literally talking about the actions that took place on the cross, not actually the symbol itself. That's not to suggest that it's wrong or bad for you to wear a cross. But if you think that your necklace or that your rosary is going to protect you from evil, we need to keep in mind that the devil himself stands before God on multiple occasions and has conversation with him. In heaven, in the end of days, there is a serious interaction between that. So, thinking that Dracula is going to run away because you are wearing your gold one or your silver one or your wooden one is a little idolatrous. So, yes, good symbolism, but keep in mind it's really important not to make that into a false idol, because what we're seeing here is the actual Ark of the Covenant, not even a replica Ark of the Covenant, but the actual Ark of the Covenant was not going to save people. It's only God himself that saves people. And the power that God has in our lives is him literally living within us. As Christians, we believe that a piece of God himself actually dwells inside of us. And that's where we receive our supernatural guidance and power and charisma from, not idolatry. Are you following with me? If that bothers you, I'm totally happy to get further into that discussion. But for now, we're going to move on. So, because Israel is defeated, the Philistines are like, hey, ain't that the Ark of the Covenant? That's their God. And they basically recognize through their eyes, through their history of idolatry worship, they're like, these are the Israelites' gods, the ones that rescued them from Egypt. Let's take their gods, thinking that the power was in the box and not God itself. So they do. And it's pretty bad for them. So what happens? It's kind of funny. I think it's kind of funny. So they take the Ark of the Covenant into their land, and it basically wreaks havoc anywhere that they put it. The Bible says tumors. Let's go to, you'll see it in chapter 5. First, they take it to Ashdod. And when they put the Ark of the Covenant in the same room, because, I mean, they're all idols, right? So they just put it in with their same little idol, which is Dagon, in his tent. The next morning they wake up and Dagon is face down in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Kind of funny. So they're like, oh, that's strange. So they set him back up. The next morning they wake up and his head and his arms and his legs are cut off and he's just a torso laying flat in front of the Ark of the Covenant. So they're like, their God has a vendetta against our God. We need to get him out of here. Well, that's not all that happens. That you can find in the first few sentences of chapter 5. But then they also find that if you go down to 5:6, the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors. It's not tumors as you're really thinking. If you take it back to the original text, he's literally talking about hemorrhoids. Did you catch that? I'm trying not to. It's hemorrhoids. Literally. The tumors that he's referring to are hemorrhoids. And not only that, but there were rats that overplagued every single town that it went to. It ended up going through 5 different territories, and in all 5 territories, people were plagued with hemorrhoids. Which is, I think the reason they changed it to tumors is because people didn't want to preach on hemorrhoids. Here's the funniest part, okay? When they decide that they are going to return the Ark of the Covenant to Israel because nobody wants it anymore, it's not fun anymore, they say, well, we shouldn't just give it back. We need to make like a grief offering, like a forgiveness offering. And so they end up making these little golden mice to put into the return journey. And they also make golden tumors to return to them as well. What those looked like, I can only imagine. Who opened them up and said, wait a minute, is that a tumor? And somebody looks at them and says, it's not a tumor. That was an Arnold Schwarzenegger quote. Just keeping it real. Hemorrhoids. Golden hemorrhoids. That's what you should get your lovely lady as a symbol this Christmas of God's goodness and divine plans being carried out. It's a beautiful necklace with a golden hemorrhoid hanging around it. Just want to sit in that for a second. Okay, moving on. So, to return the ark, they take 2 cows that have never known a yoke. They've never been bridled before. And then they also are milking cows. Okay, so a milking cow, if you know anything about cows, they don't go far from where they're being milked. They take their calves and they tuck them away and they put a harness on them and they basically say like, well, we're going to hook them up to the Ark of the Covenant, and if it goes back that way, we'll know that all of these afflictions came on us by God. But if they don't, which everything about them says that they won't because they've never been yoked before and they have calves back home. So he's like, if they don't go, then we'll know that it was just coincidence that these things happened. It wasn't really power from the ark. Well, they hook these cows up and the cows walk directly back into the land of Israel. And when they finally do arrive, they're slaughtered for burnt offering, for sacrifice, and the tumors were put into a respectable place. I just want to see the look on their faces when they opened it up and they were like, what is that, grapes? Which is not really, do you know what this is? Anyways, it's kind of funny. So Samuel gets old. The people are fearing his sons because they know that they're rotten people, and they basically demand a king. We're back caught up now. We've talked about the fun stuff. Every pregnant woman went like, yep, tumors and rats. I would have sent it away too. So God says, yes, I will give you a king, but I want you to know that this king is the people's king, basically, and what he's going to do is, he's going to take your grain, he's going to take the best, your brightest, he's going to turn them into soldiers, he's going to take your land, he's going to, like this is what you're, and they're like, yeah, that's what we want. And so he's like, fine. So he gives them Saul. Saul's origin is kind of cool too. He is a Benjamite. He comes from a rich family. He is a gorgeous man. Like, we need to understand that he is a shoulder height taller than any other man around, and it says that he's the best looking around. And so he's no joke. He's charismatic. He's generous. The people really like him. He's a hero, but he has some serious character flaws that are going to be his downfall. But to begin with, he is with his father, and their donkeys run away from the house. And the father's like, and if you want to follow along, we're in chapter 9. The father's like, hey, the donkeys are missing, go find those donkeys. So Saul takes him and another guy, and they go hunting for these mules. They can't find them anywhere. And so they arrive at this town, and his guy that he's with is like, hey, there's a really powerful prophet here. So it's Samuel, and he's like, let's go inquire of him. I've got a little bit of silver. Let's just go ask him and see what's going on. And so they get there. Great part about this whole story is that, like, Saul gets told by God, hey, I'm going to bring him to you, so don't worry about it. And Samuel prepares for Saul's arrival, prepares food, prepares place, and when he arrives, he's like, hey, you're dining with me tonight, and basically pulls him aside and says, I'm going to make you king. And he gives him some prophecies to come to fruition, and so that he knows that what he's saying is going to be true. Some really fun stuff we're not going to get into. I know I'm getting close to time, so we're almost there. Hang on tight. Okay, so it's really funny because he gets back home, and his dad's like, hey, where have you been? And he's like, oh, yeah, well, we were looking for the donkeys, and then we ran into this prophet. And he's like, really? What'd the prophet say? And he said the donkeys were found, so we should just go home. But he doesn't tell his dad. He doesn't tell anybody that he's, like, supposed to be king over Israel. And so Samuel shows up, and he's like, hey, you guys want a king, we're going to let the Lord decide. They start doing this thing called lots, which basically means that it's like a rolling of the dice, or pulling out who gets the short stick. And the idea is that the chance is not chance, it's fate, that God controls the dice. And so he basically rolls the dice on the tribes. It brings up the tribe of Benjamin. He rolls the dice on the different houses, and it comes up. Anyways, it boils down to be Saul. But Saul's nowhere to be found. And so they're like, is there one missing from here? Let's see where we are. And is there, where in 22 he says, is there a man still yet to come? And the Lord said, behold, he's hidden himself amongst the baggage. So everybody's gathered around to see what Samuel has to say, and Saul is like hiding in their stuff. Like, he's like, I'm not okay with this. But he pulls him out, and he's like, here he is, guys. Like, stand up straight. So a lot of people see him, and that there's no one else really like him, that he's so tall, and he's so good looking, and he's everything that they would want in a king. And so they're like, long live the king. But there's a few that get really jealous, and they despise him. In 27 you'll see, but some worthless fellows said, how can this man save us? And they despised him and brought him no present, but he held his peace. We're gonna basically go through the next major story, and then we're gonna stop and pick it up again next week. So Saul defeats the Ammonites. So there's this dude, Ammonites, obviously, and they go up to Gilead, and they basically say, hey, we are going to take over, you guys. And they're like, well, send us a treaty, make a treaty with us, and we'll serve you, because they're horrified. Remember, there is no judge at this time. There is no rescuer. They're just small tribes, broken up, living across the land. And he says, just make a treaty with us. So you don't have to just come in and like destroy everything. Like, make a treaty with us. And here's what he says, because he's a jerk. He says, on this condition I will make a treaty with you, that you gouge out all of your right eyes and thus bring disgrace on Israel. Because the idea was that you would have a shield and you would cover one side and your right eye would be exposed for battle. So if you gouged out your right eye, it basically meant that you were worthless. You were not ever going to fight back. And the people wail crying because they're like, you want us all to gouge out our right eyes. This is before anesthetics that we know of today. So, like, consider that for a moment. So here's their response. They said, give us 7 days and let us send a message out. And if no one will come to greet us, we will submit ourselves. Or if no one will come to save us, we'll submit ourselves to you. But give us 7 days. And so he's like, sure. He knows he's holding all the cards. So they send out this message. It reaches Saul's ear. He's plowing in the field. We have company today. He's plowing in the field, and he hears of this, and he becomes enraged. And he takes one of the oxen, and he chops it up into a whole bunch of pieces, and he sends it out to the tribes. If you've read Judges, this may sound a little bit familiar to you. He's a Benjamite, so it's kind of ironic that he's now the one doing this. I'm sure there's a lot more theology in there, but just for the sake of time, he chops up this oxen. He says, anyone who doesn't come out, this will be what happens to your oxen. And the fear of the Lord falls upon the people, and they come to his call, and they go down and they basically defeat these foes, the Amorites, and people are just like, yes, this is definitely our king. And the kingdom renewed. For the first time in Israel, they have a national leader. The really cool thing about this, and I think if you're asking me, and I'm assuming you are because you're watching, Saul was, like we said, that even through our wickedness and our inability to comprehend what God's major plan is, God still uses that to his great glory. And so he uses Saul to pave the way for monarchy amongst the Israelites. Up until now, they went from 430 years of slavery to 40 years in the wilderness to Judges roughly spans around 400 years, depending on who you ask. Because some of those, like if you just counted up their reign of the judges, you get more, you get like 410 years, but some of those reigns actually overlap, because remember, they're leaders of small pocketed people, so that's not like this leader dies and then this leader takes over. So some of those people overlap. So roughly 400 years of the time of the judges, and this is the first time a king is being introduced to unify all of the tribes. So I feel like there's a lot of reasons why it was, let's not say it was a good thing. Let's say it was, God used it to his benefit to unify the kingdom and pave way for David to come in. Because we're gonna meet David next week. He's a cool kid, man. He does get a little bit screwed up, and we're gonna go into that. But he definitely pays for that screw up. But he, I really love him as a youth, and you're gonna see why next week. So next week we're gonna start with basically the demise of Saul, his character flaws that ended up ruining his kingdom. No, we'll talk about that next week. So, I love you guys. Thanks for joining me this week, and I hope that you took something out of this and I'm really excited to get into the rest of 1 Samuel, get into 2 Samuel, get into the rule of David. So rich, so colorful, so awesome is David's rule. But mostly his coming up is really cool. We're gonna learn some really cool things about Goliath and his brothers and the kingdom, and get some really great insights into what's happening in the background. It's gonna be great. So I feel like part of this starting in 1 Samuel was just so I could get to David without the story of David needs a proper setup. So all of this really is boiling down to next week. So I hope to see you there, and I hope you guys have an awesome Tuesday. And what else can I say? I'm crazy about you.